The Age of Reason was encapsulated in a book written by Thomas Paine, printed first as easily accessible pamphlets and then books in 3 publications from 1794 to 1807. The book questioned the right to think about Christianity. In it, God's role on earth was questioned, the reasoning behind God intervening in the day-to-day by way of miracles, and along Newtonian lines thus regarded God's existence as a creator only, and so as a part of nature. They regarded the Bible as anecdotal stories, and so not atheists, they were not believers in the Christian faith. The ideas behind this book had been discussed in intellectual circles for a while, but this writing gave accessibility to them, as also caused concern, especially in England, after the events of the French Revolution, that they would spur radical thought and radical events closer to home. The book's publishers were to be prosecuted as a result, but the work caused great debate and inspiration. So, after the groundbreaking social event of the French Revolution and its subsequent leader of empire, Napoleon, taking centre stage in Europe, the rigid set of rules that had dictated what artists painted and how they painted started to shift right across Europe and Great Britain. The wider introspection of the subject matter of paintings, as well as how it was to be viewed during the latter stages of the 1800s, came hand in hand with the rapid changes taking place. These can be seen in the differing styles from as far back as Frans Hals, Diego Velázquez, Peter Paul Rubens, John Constable, J.M.W. Turner and Winslow Homer. There was a turn away from commissioned portraits for the wealthy. Science and the Enlightenment had been an eye-opener, at first reinforcing wonder in God's nature, but science soon took its practical reasoning into fascinating areas for many, including artists. The idea of light especially. A little about the history of the science behind this. The exploration of optics had been around since Plato made it one of his preoccupations, but it took a scientist from Basra, who was close to the court in Cairo, to write a book on optics in 1011. Hassan ibn al-Haytham, or Al-Hazan, was considered a key part in the science of optics, and his thinking would subsequently be translated into early Renaissance ideas. His experiments and thoughts were about reflection and refraction, in which he proposed a new system for explaining vision and light based on observation and experiment, the antithesis to Plato's ideas of light emanating, the emission theory, from the human eye. This was later questioned by Euclid, based on his assertions in geometry, questioning how the stars were immediately visible on opening the eye. But it was Al-Hazan who brought in the idea of light bouncing off objects in reflections and refraction, introducing the concept of the speed of light. Later, in the 16th century, Leonardo da Vinci would examine the eye and come across the idea of peripheral vision. And in the 18th century, Isaac Newton would separate colours into the spectrum of light. In the 20th century, Gestalt theory would re-look at how light is organised in terms of influence on the brain, and so light having a two-way street relationship between the now much more understood light source, its path and wave patterns, along with its destination surfaces, coupled with far more understanding about the receiving mechanism of the eye. This is still being discussed. As I mentioned, throughout most of this newly discovered world, art was seen as folkloric. This had post-colonial legacy too, as traditions in art, although embraced on one folkloric level, never quite managed to cut the mustard as actual art until much later into the 20th century. The Whitney Museum in New York City being one of the first to exhibit folkloric and indigenous art. The American Folklore Museum, after initially showing both indigenous and émigré art of the early settlers, widened its scope to include many forms of art without a genre. This could be called outsider art, naive art by non-schooled artists, folksy art, or tribal art. There are many names. This art could be found all over the globe. In India, for example, Kerala being one of many, now noticeable cultural lines of discovery with dramatic and intricately decorated costumes and masks, art showing the many layers of the Indian subcontinent's past. Folkloric arts and crafts, as described in European terms, was still a West-orientated, subjective view. Take Africa, for example. The continent itself was subject to mass colonisation and a massive reshaping of its indigenous beliefs and principles. The French, for one, required Africans in their territory to assimilate into the French way, learning the language and religion. But although Africa, through this process, has many diversities, there are similarities, especially involved in producing art. In many areas of Africa, the object was never as important as the soul or forces behind the creation of the object, and so follows that its art must be of a revolutionary nature, and in being revolutionary, it must also be collective, committing and functional. A far different approach to the making and reasoning behind depictions or rendering of objects in Africa's European counterparts. Art and its borders had begun to blur through travel during colonial times, a surge of art that differed in style and content as never before. Artists were taking their work into this new production-obsessed world, and artists were not restricted to their country of birth. Argentinian artists were to be exhibited in Paris. Armenian artists were to look to St. Petersburg and Persia. The Philippines had their own style of Filipino art. The genre was initiated by Fabian de la Rosa, who studied in Paris and travelled extensively to Rome, Geneva, Munich, Germany and Madrid during the turn of the 20th century. In short, many artists and styles traversed borders like never before. The propensity to categorise art into styles had become the norm, and discussion around that emphasised by the new emerging band of critics. This early form of art categorisation was initially by nation and later began to become more defined, only to be conveniently brought in during the 1930s to be used as a defining tool in categorisation for Northern art, advocated by the Nazis with their preference for classic and German art over modern or degenerate art. But the categorising of certain styles began to diversify with Impressionism and its Italian offshoot, macchiaioli, for example, a form of outdoor painting with light brushstrokes or macchi, patches or spots that, according to critics, never quite delved into the optical science of its French counterparts, blue being an absent colour. The first American documenters on reaching the shores back in the 1600s would turn into an array of artist styles that would massively influence the worldview of art over the next 2 centuries. In short, the world was awash with art. It always had been, true, but With this global traversing of trade, travel and colonisation, it was the critical documentation of it that began to give art a framework of reference, as, by being placed into critical categories, the framework became the Bible, as it were, in terms of historical and critical art theory, which, as it was to be viewed through the lens of specific critics and historians who were mainly European and American, the reference points were also from a Western perspective. If the art of the early Renaissance was all about promoting religion, and the art of the 1600s and 1700s was all about promoting the wealthy self, then the art of the 1800s was all about introspection, in throwing off the shackles of all that.